I need you to understand something before I say any of this. I'm not crazy. I passed every psych evaluation. They gave me 3 of them, actually, and the county still has my file marked fit for duty. I held that job for 11 months. I showed up on time. I logged every temperature reading. I never drank on shift. I never fell asleep. So when I tell you that the bodies in the freezer were moving, I need you to hear me. Not twitching, not settling, moving, changing positions. And I don't mean over weeks. I mean between rounds. I mean I'd walk in at 2:15 a.m. and a dead man's arm would be at his side. And I'd walk in again at 3:40 and that same arm would be across his chest, fingers curled like he'd been clutching something in a dream he wasn't supposed to be having. I reported it 3 times. I was told the same thing every time. Post-mortem muscle contraction, gas expansion, temperature fluctuation causing tissue shift. They had an answer for everything, but they never had an answer for the footprints. I'll get to that. I took the job in March of last year. Weldon County, Iowa. You won't find much about it. Population hovers around 4,000. Flat land, grain silos, the kind of place where the post office closes at noon on Wednesdays and nobody thinks that's strange. I'd moved there after a rough stretch in Omaha, lost my apartment after a layoff, spent 2 months on a friend's couch, and eventually found a listing on one of those county job boards that still looks like it was built in 2003. The listing read, Weldon County Coroner's Office Auxiliary Cold Storage Attendant Night Shift, $19.50 per hour, no degree required. Background check mandatory, $19.50 an hour in a place where rent was $600 a month. I didn't care what the job was. I applied the same afternoon. The interview was at the County Services Building on Grainer Road, a long single-story building with brown brick and windows so narrow they looked like they were squinting. A woman named Dolores handled my paperwork, mid-60s, reading glasses on a chain, the kind of person who calls everyone hun and means it. She told me the facility I'd be working at wasn't the main coroner's office. It was an overflow unit. We've got the primary morgue at St. David's, she said, not looking up from her clipboard. Holds 8, but when we get backlog bad winters, flu season, the occasional pile up on Route 6, we use the auxiliary unit out on Packer Road. How often does it back up? I asked. More than you'd think for a county this size. She looked at me over her glasses. Unclaimed bodies take time to process. Estate cases, forensic holds. Sometimes the state just forgets about people. She said that last part quieter than the rest. The facility was about 12 minutes east of town. You took Grainer to Route 6, turned north on Packer Road, which was gravel for the last mile, and eventually you'd see it, a squat gray cinder block building sitting in the middle of a cleared lot surrounded by dead soybean fields. No sign out front, no flag, just a chain link fence with a padlock and a gravel parking area that could hold maybe 4 cars. It had been a commercial meat storage facility in the 80s, Dolores told me. The county bought it in 2004 after a hepatitis outbreak overwhelmed the morgue at St. David's. They retrofitted it new lighting, a small office near the entrance, a bathroom that barely worked, but the bones of the building were the same. Industrial insulation, poured concrete floors with drain channels. And the freezer. The freezer was the whole point. It was a walk-in cold storage unit that took up about 60% of the building's footprint, commercial grade, the kind designed to hold hanging beef carcasses at scale. The walls were brushed stainless steel, fogged and scratched from decades of use. The floor was rubberized, grating over a drainage system, and the temperature sat at a steady 34 degrees, cold enough to preserve, not cold enough to freeze solid, which apparently mattered for forensic integrity. There were 12 steel tables inside, arranged in 2 rows of 6 bolted to the floor. Each table had a rim, like a shallow tray, to catch fluid. Above each table was a tag holder, a small metal clip where you'd slide in a card with the decedent's name, date of intake, and case number. When I started, 7 of the 12 tables were occupied. My job was simple, deceptively simple actually, which should have been my first warning. I worked 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. My responsibilities were check the thermostat every 90 minutes and log the reading in a binder kept in the front office. Make sure the backup generator indicator light stayed green. Walk the freezer once per round to confirm storage integrity, which basically meant making sure nothing had fallen, leaked, or been disturbed. Lock the main door at the start of shift and unlock it at the end. Log any deliveries or pickups, though those almost never happened at night. That was it. The rest of the time I sat in the front office, a 10 by 10 room with a metal desk, a space heater that clicked every 40 seconds, and a small TV with an antenna that pulled in 2.5 channels. There was no internet. Cell signal was unreliable. I brought books. For the first 3 weeks, the job was exactly what it looked like. Boring, cold, and lonely. I'd do my rounds, write down 34.1 degrees Fahrenheit or 33.8 degrees Fahrenheit in the binder, glance at the bodies under their white sheets, and go back to reading. The bodies didn't bother me. I'd expected them to. I'd never worked around the dead before, but there was something about the clinical environment that stripped away the dread. They were just still shapes under fabric, evidence of lives that had ended. It felt more like a storage unit than a morgue. The other staff were daytime only. A guy named Kendall came in 3 mornings a week to handle intake paperwork and coordinate with the coroner's office. A cleaning crew of 2 came every other Thursday, and once in a while a transport team from St. David's would show up in a white van to either drop off or pick up. I overlapped with Kendall for about 20 minutes each morning during shift change, but our conversations never went past small talk. He was a quiet guy, late 40s, thin, with a patchy beard, and a way of looking past you when he talked, like he was reading something over your shoulder. He'd been working the auxiliary unit for 6 years. When I asked him if anything weird had ever happened there, he just said, "Define weird." I laughed. He didn't. The first month passed without incident. I settled into the rhythm. Drive out to the facility at 9:45. Park, unlock the gate and the front door, check the thermostat, walk the freezer, sit down, read, repeat every 90 minutes until 6. Lock up, drive home, sleep until mid-afternoon. Do it again. I started recognizing the bodies by their tag cards, not by looking at them. I never lifted the sheets unless something seemed off, but by their names and positions on the tables. 7 bodies, 7 quiet shapes under white sheets, 7 people who had stopped being people and had become inventory. I know how cold that sounds, but that's what the job does to you. You can't think of them as someone's mother, someone's husband, someone's child. Not at 3 a.m. in a freezer that hums like it's thinking. You just check the temperature and move on. It was April 7th when things changed. I remember the date because I'd written it at the top of the logbook page and then stared at it for a while, thinking about how I'd been doing this for almost a month and hadn't missed a single entry. Small pride, the kind of thing you hold on to when the rest of your life feels shapeless. I did my 11:30 round, walked into the freezer. Cold hit me the way it always did. Not a gust, but a press, like the air itself had weight. I walked the center aisle between the 2 rows of tables. Sheets all in place, tag cards in their clips. Thermostat read 34.0, I logged it. At 1 a.m., I did the next round. Same routine, same results. I remember glancing at table 7, Roger Malby, and noticing that the sheet had a small crease near the head, like it had been folded slightly. I didn't think much of it. Sheets shift, air pressure when you open the door. Nothing. At 2:30, I walked back in, and I stopped. His left arm was outside the sheet, not dangling off the table, not slipped from a fold. His arm was resting on top of the sheet, palm down, fingers slightly spread, as if he'd placed it there deliberately. The sheet was still tucked neatly around the rest of his body. Just the arm, out, positioned. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I could hear the hum of the cooling unit, the faint buzz of the fluorescent light in the corridor behind me, and my own breathing, which had gotten louder than I wanted it to be. I told myself it was nothing. Bodies do things. Gases build, muscles contract. I'd read about it during my first week, looked it up on my phone during a break when the signal held long enough to load a Wikipedia page. Post-mortem spasms, it happens. But the arm wasn't contracted. It wasn't stiff or curled. It was relaxed. The fingers were slightly spread, like someone resting their hand on a desk. I walked closer. My footsteps on the rubber grating sounded too loud. I reached table 7 and looked down at the arm. The skin was gray-blue, the way skin gets in cold storage. The fingernails had a faint yellow tint. There was a small tattoo on the inner wrist, a compass rose, about the size of a quarter. I hadn't noticed it before because I'd never looked that closely. I lifted the arm. It was cold and heavy, but not rigid, which surprised me. Rigor mortis comes and goes, I knew that. But Malvi had been dead for over a month. The body should have been well past the rigor cycle and into general decomposition, slowed but not stopped by the cold. The arm felt loose, compliant, like lifting the arm of someone in a deep sleep. I tucked it back under the sheet. I smoothed the fabric. I stepped back, and then I left the freezer, closed the heavy steel door behind me, and sat in the office for 45 minutes without moving. At 4 a.m. I went back in. I had to. It was my job. The arm was under the sheet. Everything looked normal. I logged the temperature, 34.1, and left. I told myself it was nothing. I almost believed it. 2 nights later, it happened again, but not with Malvi. This time it was table 2, the unidentified male. The John Doe found on the shoulder of Route 6. When I walked in for my 1 a.m. round, his head was turned to the left. Now I need to be precise about this because precision is the only thing that kept me sane during those months. The bodies on the tables were always positioned face up, arms at their sides, sheets draped from collarbone to feet. That was intake protocol. Kendall had mentioned it once. They arrive however they arrive, and they get positioned supine, face up, centered on the table. This man's head was turned to the left, not slightly, fully. His face under the thin sheet was pointing toward table 1, toward Margaret Hoffman. I checked my previous log entry. I'd been in the freezer 90 minutes earlier. I hadn't noted anything unusual. Face up, sheet in place. I was sure of it. I stood at the foot of table 2 and stared at the shape of his head under the fabric. The sheet clung to the topography of his features, the ridge of his nose, the hollows of his eyes, the slightly parted line of his lips. He was facing left, toward the woman on table 1. I didn't touch him. I didn't reposition him. I backed out of the freezer and went to the office. I sat at the desk and opened the logbook and wrote very carefully. 1:07 a.m., table 2, head position changed. Was face up at 11:30 check, now turn left. No other disturbances noted. I stared at what I'd written. It looked clinical, responsible, like something that would be taken seriously. It wasn't. The next morning, when Kendall came in, I showed him the entry. He read it, closed the binder, and said, "Bodies move sometimes, tissue contracts. You'll get used to it." His head was turned 90 degrees, I said. Temperature differential can do that. The side facing the vent gets colder. Muscles on the opposite side tighten. Head rotates. Happens. He said it the way you'd explain why a door creaks. Mechanical, disinterested. And then he went into the freezer for his morning check and came back out 3 minutes later without mentioning it. I wanted to push it. I wanted to say, that's not how muscles work and we both know it. But I'd been there a month. He'd been there 6 years, and I needed the job. So I let it go, for about a week. The next few nights were quiet. I did my rounds, temperatures logged, sheets undisturbed. I started to relax again, started to fold the incidents into the mental category of things that happen in jobs like this. I read my books. I listened to the heater click. I watched the snow turn to rain, turn to mud outside the narrow office window. And then April 16th came. I walked into the freezer at midnight for my standard check, and I immediately knew something was wrong. I couldn't identify it at first. The temperature was normal, the lights were on, the hum was steady, but there was a feeling. You know the feeling I mean. The one where your body knows something before your brain does. The one that makes the hair on your forearms stand up and your breathing go shallow. I walked the aisle, I checked each table. Table 1, Margaret Hoffman, fine. Table 2, John Doe, fine. Face up, sheet in place. Table 4, Dale Emmerich, fine. Table 5, Infant Doe, fine. Table 7, Roger Malvi, fine. Table 9, Teresa Lunt. I stopped. Teresa Lunt was sitting up, not fully, not bolt upright like in a movie, but her upper body was elevated maybe 30 degrees off the table surface, as if someone had placed a pillow behind her back. The sheet had slid down to her waist. Her head was tilted forward, chin near her chest. Her hands were in her lap. I want to describe what I felt in that moment, but I don't think the English language has a word for it. It wasn't fear exactly, it wasn't shock, it was more like the feeling of the floor disappearing beneath you that splits second on a roller coaster when gravity lets go and your stomach floats and your brain screams, "This is wrong," before the rational part catches up and says, "No, you're safe, there are rails." Except there were no rails. I was standing in a freezer at midnight looking at a dead woman who had been lying flat 90 minutes ago and was now sitting up with her hands in her lap like she was waiting for someone to bring her tea. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stood there, breathing clouds into the cold air, staring at her. The fluorescent light above her table flickered once a short, sharp blink, and I flinched so hard I bit my tongue. Then I did something I'm still not sure was brave or stupid. I walked closer. Her skin was the same gray-blue as Malvi's had been. Her hair, dark brown, shoulder length, hung forward around her face. I couldn't see her expression. I didn't want to, but I noticed her hands. They were resting in her lap, palms up, fingers loosely curled. And her fingernails, I noticed this very clearly, her fingernails had scratches on them. Tiny parallel scratches on the underside of each nail, like she'd been dragging them against something rough. That detail broke me. Not emotionally, something else. Some internal gauge that separates "this can be explained" from "this cannot." That gauge snapped, because dead women don't scratch things. Dead women don't sit up, and dead women don't fold their hands. I left the freezer. I locked the door. I went to the office and picked up the desk phone, a beige rotary model that looked like it predated the building, and called the after-hours line for the coroner's office. A man answered, not the coroner, some kind of night dispatcher. I told him my name, my location, and that I had a body that had changed positions significantly. I used the word significantly. I thought it sounded professional. There was a pause. Then he asked, "Which table?" 9, Teresa Lunt. Another pause, longer this time. "Is the temperature stable?" 34.1. "And the door, is it secured?" "I locked it, yes." "Okay." His voice had changed. Not alarmed exactly, but focused. Like I'd said a word that activated something. "Don't go back in. Stay in the office. Someone will be there within the hour." "Within the hour? It's midnight. Who's coming at—" "Just stay in the office. Don't open the freezer door." He hung up. I sat at the desk and stared at the phone. The heater clicked. 40 seconds. Click. 40 seconds. Click. I counted 12 cycles before I heard tires on gravel. A black SUV pulled into the lot. No markings, no county seal. Just a dark vehicle with tinted windows and mud on the wheel wells. 2 people got out. A man and a woman, both in dark jackets. Not uniforms, plain clothes. The man was tall, maybe 6'2", with a shaved head and the kind of posture that comes from either military service or chronic back pain. The woman was shorter, compact, with her hair pulled back tight and a clipboard under her arm. They didn't knock. The front door was unlocked. I hadn't thought to lock it, and they walked in like they'd been here before. The man looked at me. The woman looked past me, toward the corridor that led to the freezer. "You're the attendant?" the man said. "Yeah, I called about table 9, we know." He turned to the woman. "Kit's in the back." She left without a word. He stayed, standing in the middle of the office, hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't show ID. He just stood there looking at the door to the corridor, and then he said something that I've replayed in my head 1,000 times since. "How long have you been working here?" "About a month." "And this is the first time?" I didn't like the way he said first time. It implied there would be others. "The first time what?" I asked. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and his expression wasn't suspicious or hostile. It was something closer to pity. "The first time you've noticed," he said. The woman came back with a hard-sided black case, the kind photographers use for equipment. They went into the freezer together. I stayed in the office like the dispatcher had told me to. I could hear them through the walls, muffled voices, the occasional metallic sound, what might have been a camera shutter. They were in there for about 20 minutes. When they came out, the woman was writing on her clipboard, and the man was carrying the case, which looked heavier than before. "She's been repositioned," the man said. "Supine, standard. You just put her back down," I said. "It's been documented. There's nothing else to do tonight." He set the case down by the door. "You'll continue your rounds as normal. Log temperatures. If it happens again, and it may you call the same number. Same protocol." "Protocol?" I almost laughed. "What protocol?" "Nobody told me there was a protocol for this." The woman looked up from her clipboard. "It's in your intake paperwork. Section 4. Anomalous physical changes to stored remains should be reported immediately via the after-hours line." You signed it. I had. I remembered signing a stack of forms during my first day. I hadn't read all of them. Nobody reads all of them. "Who are you people?" I asked. The man picked up the case. "County services, good night." They left. The SUV pulled out of the lot, and the taillights disappeared down Packer Road, and I was alone again with 7 bodies and a silence so thick I could feel it on my skin. I didn't go back into the freezer for the rest of the shift. I know that was a dereliction of duty. I logged estimated temperatures based on the pattern from previous nights. 34, 34.1, 34, 33.9. Close enough to be plausible. I sat in the office with the heater clicking and my book unopened on the desk, and I waited for 6 o'clock like a man waiting for a pardon. When Kendall arrived for the morning shift, I told him what happened. All of it. The sitting up, the phone call, the 2 people in the SUV. He listened, he nodded, and then he said, "You did the right thing calling it in." "But what is it?" I pressed. "What's happening to them?" He was quiet for a long time. He took off his jacket and hung it on the hook behind the door, the way he always did. And then he sat on the edge of the desk and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as exhausted. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and you're going to decide whether you want to keep working here. That's your call. But if you stay, you follow the rules, and you don't ask questions outside this building. Understood?" I nodded. "It's been happening since before I started, since before the county even bought this building, as far as I can tell. Every attendant who's worked the night shift has reported it. Some quit after the first incident. Some last a few months. I've been here the longest." He paused. "The bodies move. Not all of them. Not every night. But regularly enough that there's a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" "New intakes are usually still for the first 2 to 3 weeks. After that, small movements start. An arm shifts, a head turns, fingers curl. It's gradual. And it's always at night, always between midnight and 4 a.m. Never during the day. Never when the freezer door is open. Only when they're alone in the dark." I felt something cold crawl up my spine, and it wasn't the temperature. "That's impossible," I said. "I know. Dead bodies don't." "I know." He said it harder this time. Not angry, just final. "I've read every paper on post-mortem movement. I've talked to the coroner. I've talked to 2 forensic pathologists at the state level. None of it explains what happens here. The movements are too deliberate, too coordinated, and they've been documented for almost 20 years. 20 years? The county has files going back to 2006, but the previous owner, the one who ran this as a meat storage facility, he reported similar things in the 80s. Cattle carcasses found in different positions overnight, hooks rearranged. He thought it was vandals. Put in cameras. The cameras showed nothing. Nothing. The footage would be normal up to a certain point, and then there'd be a gap. Not static, not corruption, just a jump. One frame, everything's in place. Next frame, things have moved. No motion in between, like someone cut the film. I sat with that for a while. The morning light was coming through the narrow office window, gray and thin, and I could hear a truck passing on Route 6 in the distance. Normal sounds, the world doing what it does. "Why doesn't anyone shut this place down?" I asked. Kendall almost smiled. Almost. "Where would the bodies go? St. David's can't hold them all. Nearest county with overflow capacity is 3 hours away. And what would the reason be? The dead people keep rearranging themselves? Nobody with authority wants that on their record. So instead, we have the protocol. We document, we call it in, they send the team repositions, and life goes on. That's insane. That's government. He stood up and walked to the corridor. I'm going to do my morning check. Go home, get some sleep, and think about whether you're coming back tonight. I drove home. I didn't sleep. I lay on my bed in my small apartment above a hardware store on Main Street and stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself that everything Kendall had said was an elaborate hazing ritual. New guy gets spooked. Co-workers have a laugh. Classic. But the arm. Malvi's arm resting on top of the sheet with the compass rose tattoo visible and the fingers slightly spread. That wasn't a prank. That wasn't a gas bubble or a temperature differential. That was a dead man moving his arm in the dark. I went back that night. I don't know why. Money probably. Or stubbornness. Or the thing that horror movies never get right. The fact that real fear doesn't always make you run. Sometimes it makes you need to understand. The not knowing is worse than the knowing. At least that's what I thought at the time. I was wrong about that. The knowing is worse. The knowing is so much worse. For the next 2 weeks, I approached the job differently. I wasn't just an attendant anymore. I was a researcher, an observer. I started bringing a notebook separate from the official logbook, and I documented everything. I mapped the freezer, drew a diagram of the 12 tables with their positions relative to the door, the vents, the light fixtures, the drainage channels. I noted which bodies were on which tables, their intake dates, their causes of death. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored: the exact position of each sheet, the angle of each head, the placement of hands and arms. Before each round, I'd pause at the freezer door and take a breath. Then I'd open it, step inside, and walk the aisle slowly, comparing what I saw to what I'd documented 90 minutes earlier. Most nights, nothing changed. The bodies lay there, still and cold, exactly as they'd been. The freezer hummed, the light buzzed, the air pressed against me like a damp hand. But then there were the other nights. April 22nd, Table 4, Dale Emmerich. Both hands moved from his sides to his chest, fingers interlocked, like a man lying in a casket at a funeral. I found him this way at 2 a.m. By my 3:30 check, his hands were back at his sides. April 25th, Table 1, Margaret Hoffman. Sheet pulled up higher than normal from collarbone level to just below her chin, as if she'd tugged it up in her sleep. The fabric was smooth and tucked. No wrinkles, no signs of mechanical disturbance. April 29th, Table 11, Carl De Jong. His feet were crossed at the ankles, left over right. They had been parallel at my previous check. I measured the distance between the table edge and his left foot with a piece of string and marked it in my notebook. The next round, the feet were uncrossed. The measurement matched exactly. Back to the original position. That was the detail that chilled me most. Not just the movement, the return. They were going back, as if they knew they'd been seen, or as if whatever moved them was resetting. I called the after-hours line twice during this period. Both times the same dispatcher answered. Both times he asked the same questions: which table? What was the temperature? Was the door secured? Both times he told me to stay in the office. But the SUV team never came back. I started to wonder if they only responded to the dramatic incidents. I asked Kendall about it during one of our morning overlaps. They come when they feel it's necessary, he said. Small movements don't trigger a response. It's when the positions become complex. Complex how? He didn't answer. I started setting traps. Nothing sophisticated, I didn't have the resources for that. But I'd tear small pieces of masking tape and place them at key points. Across the sheet at chest level, between the edge of the sheet and the table surface. Across the gap between two fingers. If anything moved, the tape would break or shift. The first few nights, the tape was undisturbed. Then, on May 3rd, I placed tape on all 7 occupied tables at 11:30 p.m. and checked at 1 a.m. Tables 1, 4, 5, 7, and 11, tape intact. Table 2, John Doe's tape at chest level was broken. Clean break, not stretched. The sheet had been moved and smoothed back into place. Table 9, Teresa Lunt. All 3 pieces of tape were gone. Not broken, gone, as if they'd never been placed. I searched the floor around her table. Nothing. I checked under the table, in the drainage grating, in the corners of the freezer. The tape had simply ceased to exist. That night, I sat in the office and wrote a very long entry in my personal notebook. I filled 6 pages, I diagrammed the tape placements, I recorded times, temperatures, observations, and at the bottom of the last page, I wrote a question that I couldn't stop thinking about. Are they aware? May came, and with it a change in the facility's population. 2 bodies were transferred out. Margaret Hoffman was finally claimed by a nephew in Wisconsin, and the infant on table 5 was moved to a state facility for burial. But 3 new ones came in, 8 bodies now. And with the new arrivals, the dynamic in the freezer changed. I don't know how else to describe it. Dynamic is the right word, even though it shouldn't be. A room full of dead people shouldn't have a dynamic. But it did. The air felt different. The hum of the cooling unit seemed to fluctuate in ways it hadn't before, not in temperature, but in pitch. And the movements accelerated. The new bodies followed the pattern Kendall had described still for the first 2 weeks. But the older ones, the ones who'd been there for months, became more active. Table 2, John Doe, was the worst. Almost every night something about him was different. Head turned, arm repositioned, sheet shifted, and twice on May 8th and May 14th I found him with his sheet pulled completely off, bunched at his feet like he'd kicked it away in the night. His body was fully exposed on the table, gray-blue and waxy, wearing the same clothes he'd been found in, a flannel shirt and jeans, dirt-stained and torn at the knee. His eyes were closed, his mouth was open, just slightly, showing a sliver of dark teeth. I replaced the sheet both times. Both times, my hands were shaking. Roger Malvey on table 7 developed a new behavior. His head, which had previously stayed face-up between movements, began consistently turning to face the door. Every time I walked in, he was facing me. Sheet in place, body still, but his head unmistakably oriented toward the entrance, as if he heard me coming. Teresa Lund continued to be the most disturbing. She didn't just shift, she posed. There's no other word for it. One night, her hands were clasped behind her head like someone sunbathing. Another night, her left arm was extended straight out from her body, index finger pointing at the wall. When I followed the line of her finger, it pointed to a spot on the stainless steel wall where, if I looked very closely, I could see faint scratches. Not words, not symbols, just scratches. Thin, parallel, like the ones I'd seen on her fingernails weeks earlier. I photographed the scratches with my phone. In the morning light, reviewing the photos at home, they looked like nothing. Random marks on old metal. But at 2 a.m., standing in that freezer, following a dead woman's pointing finger to the wall, they looked like a message I couldn't read. I brought a flashlight on my next shift and examined the walls more carefully. The scratches weren't just in one place. They were everywhere, faint, easy to miss under the fluorescent light, but present on every wall panel, concentrated at about waist height. Some were vertical, some horizontal, some curved. They covered nearly every surface, layered over each other, some clearly older than others, based on the depth and oxidation of the marks. Something had been scratching the walls of this freezer for a very long time. I showed Kendall the photos. He looked at them for about 3 seconds and handed my phone back. "Don't take photos inside the facility," he said. "It's against protocol." "Kendall, the walls are covered in scratch marks. How does that not delete the photos and don't bring your phone into the freezer again?" His tone was different. Not the weary, conspiratorial tone from our earlier conversation. This was colder, harder, like a door closing. I deleted the photos, on my phone at least. I'd already emailed them to myself. That night, May 16th, I broke one of my own rules. I set an alarm for 1:45 a.m., and instead of doing my round at the normal time, I stood outside the freezer door and listened. The facility was quiet. The heater in the office clicked faintly behind me. The fluorescent light in the corridor buzzed at its usual frequency. And from behind the heavy steel door of the freezer, I heard nothing. At first, then a sound, low, barely audible. Not mechanical, the cooling unit had a specific pitch. And this wasn't it. This was lower, irregular, almost rhythmic. I pressed my ear to the door. The steel was cold against my skin. The sound was clearer now, tapping, not loud, not frantic, measured, deliberate, like fingers drumming slowly on a steel table. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 tap. The pattern repeated, over and over. I stood there for 4 full minutes, counting the repetitions. 23 cycles of the same pattern before I pulled my ear away. My heart was doing something it had never done before, not racing, but pounding. Deep, heavy beats that I could feel in my throat. I opened the door. The tapping stopped. I walked in. The freezer was exactly as I'd left it 90 minutes earlier. Bodies in place, sheets smooth, temperature at 34.0. But there was something on the floor. In the center of the aisle, between the 2 rows of tables, there was a smear on the rubberized grating. Wet, slightly viscous, about 3 feet long, as if something had been dragged or had dragged itself across the floor. I crouched down. The smear had a faint pinkish tint. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I knew what it was. In a facility full of decomposing bodies, you learn to recognize biological fluid. Something had been on the floor. I followed the smear with my eyes. It started near table 9, Teresa Lunt, and ended near table 2, John Doe, a straight line between them, as if she'd reached down from her table, or he'd reached down from his, and something had passed between them on the ground. I checked both bodies. Both were lying flat, sheets in place, arms at their sides. No visible fluid on the sheets, no disturbance. They looked exactly as they should. But Teresa Lunt's right hand, the one closest to the aisle, was hanging slightly off the edge of the table. Just the fingers, just barely. And they were wet. I need to stop here and address something. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, why didn't you quit? Why didn't you walk out, drive home, and never go back? I've asked myself that question every day since. And the honest answer is, because the job had become something more than a job. It had become a compulsion. The mystery of it, the mechanics of it, had hooked into a part of my brain that wouldn't let go. I was terrified, yes. Every night, walking into that freezer, my body screamed at me to stop. But my mind, my stupid, curious, pattern-seeking mind, wanted to understand. What were they doing? Why did they move? Was it conscious? Was it random? Was there a purpose? And the biggest question, the one I kept circling back to, why only in the dark? Why only when no one was watching? I started reading everything I could find about post-mortem phenomena. I went to the Weldon Public Library, a small building on Elm Street that smelled like carpet glue and old paper, and I read medical journals, forensic textbooks, even fringe research papers about anomalous mortuary events. Most of it was useless, but I found one thing, a paper from 1994, published in a regional forensic science journal that no longer existed. The author was a pathologist named Dr. Edwin Carey, based out of a small county in Minnesota. The paper was titled Observed Postmortem Kinetic Events in Long-Term Cold Storage, a case series. Dr. Carey documented 14 instances of unexplained body movement in a county cold storage facility over a 3-year period. The movements he described were almost identical to what I was seeing: limb repositioning, head rotation, seated elevation, sheet displacement. He proposed no mechanism. He offered no theory. The paper simply documented the events with clinical precision and ended with a single line. Further investigation is warranted, but unlikely to receive institutional support. The paper had been cited 0 times. I tried to find Dr. Carey. He wasn't listed in any current medical directory. A search of Minnesota death records available through a public genealogy database showed an Edwin R. Carey who died in 1999. Cause of death, hypothermia. Found in his home with the thermostat turned down to its lowest setting in July. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a long time after reading that. May 20th was when I found the footprints. I'd mentioned footprints earlier. I said the county never had an answer for them. That was true, but I need to tell you how I found them because the context matters. It was 3:15 a.m. I'd done my 230 round without incident. Everything in place, nothing unusual. I was back in the office reading a paperback I'd picked up at the library book sale, trying to keep my mind from cycling through the same questions. The heater clicked, the wind pushed against the window. Then I heard something. Not from the freezer, from outside. A scraping sound. Metal on concrete. It came from the back of the building, the side I'd never paid much attention to because there was no door there, just the exterior wall of the freezer. I went to the front door and opened it. The night was overcast, no moon, the kind of darkness where you can feel the sky pressing down. I walked around the side of the building, my flashlight cutting a weak cone through the dark. Gravel crunched under my boots. The air smelled like wet earth and the faint, sweet, sick smell that always lingered around the building's exterior. The smell of what was inside, leaking through the walls in ways the insulation couldn't fully prevent. I reached the back wall and swept my flashlight along the ground. Footprints. In the mud along the base of the building, there were footprints, bare feet, human-sized. They came from the direction of the soybean field to the south and ended at the back wall of the freezer. Not at a door, there was no door there. At the wall, as if whoever made them had walked straight into the cinder block and disappeared. I crouched down. The prints were clear. 5 toes, an arch, a heel impression. They were deep, as if the person had been standing in each spot for a while, shifting their weight. And they were cold. I touched one, pressing my finger into the mud at the base of a heel print, and the mud was ice cold. Not cool from the night cold, cold, like the inside of the freezer. There were no prints leading away from the wall, only toward it. I counted them. 14 footprints forming an irregular path from the field to the building. Some were close together, some widely spaced, as if the walker had been staggering or uncertain of the terrain. And they were all left feet. Every single print was a left foot. I stood up and backed away. My flashlight beam was shaking because my hand was shaking. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat in the office until morning. When Kendall arrived, I took him outside and showed him the prints. He looked at them for a long time. His face did something I hadn't seen before, a micro-expression, a flicker of something between recognition and dread that passed so quickly I might have imagined it. "I'll report it," he said. "Kendall, those are bare footprints, leading to a wall, all left feet, in the middle of nowhere, at 3 in the morning. I'll report it." "Report it to who? The people in the SUV? Who are they? What is this place? What are we actually doing here?" He turned and walked back inside without answering. When I followed him, he was on the desk phone, speaking quietly. I caught fragments. Exterior south wall, 14 impressions, left lateral only. Yes, same as before. Same as before. This had happened before. The next few days were strange in a different way. Quiet, too quiet. The freezer was still. Every round, every check, nothing moved. Nothing changed. The bodies lay exactly where they should. Sheets smooth, arms at sides, heads face up. The temperature held at a perfect 34.0, not fluctuating by even a tenth of a degree. The silence in the freezer was absolute. No tapping, no sounds, not even the usual subtle settling noises that cold buildings make. It felt like the building was holding its breath. On May 23rd, a new body arrived. This one came at night, the first nighttime delivery since I'd started. A white van from St. David's pulled up at 1:30 a.m. 2 transport techs in scrubs wheeled a gurney in through the front entrance. The body was in a standard black bag, zipped to the top. I signed the intake form. The tag card read, "I didn't ask questions. I followed protocol." I walked the gurney into the freezer, helped transfer the body to table 6, positioned it supine, draped the sheet, slid the tag card into the clip. The 2 techs left without small talk. 9 bodies now. And something about Anna Corin's arrival changed everything again. Within 3 nights, the movements resumed, but they were different, more intense, more coordinated, as if her presence had triggered something in the others. May 26th, 2 a.m. I walked into the freezer and found every single body with their head turned toward table 6. All of them. 8 heads, all facing the same direction, all oriented toward the new arrival. Anna Corrin herself was still face up, sheet in place, untouched, but everyone else was looking at her. I stood in the doorway and felt the air change. Not the temperature, the pressure. Like the room had contracted slightly, the walls pulling inward by some imperceptible amount. The fluorescent light above table 6 was brighter than the others. Or maybe I was imagining that. But the shadows under the table seemed deeper, thicker, as if the darkness itself was pooling. I didn't reposition any of them. I couldn't bring myself to touch them. I logged it. All bodies oriented toward T6, no other disturbance. By my 3:30 round, they'd all returned to face-up position. As if nothing had happened. May 28th, the tapping returned. Same pattern as before. Tap, 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 pause, but louder now. And it wasn't coming from one source. It was coming from multiple tables simultaneously. A chorus of dead fingers drumming on steel. I didn't open the door. I stood in the corridor and listened for 11 minutes. The tapping maintained its rhythm perfectly. Every table in sync, like a heartbeat. Then it stopped, all at once, mid-pattern. And in the silence that followed, I heard something else. Something that made me press my back against the corridor wall and slide down to the floor. A voice, muffled, distant, as if coming from underwater or behind thick glass. I couldn't make out words if there were words. It was more like a vocalization, a low sustained sound that rose and fell in pitch, almost like humming, almost like breathing through a constricted throat. Almost, and this is the part that still keeps me awake, almost like someone trying to remember how to speak. It lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then silence. I didn't do another round that night. I sat on the corridor floor with my back against the wall and my arms around my knees, and I waited for morning. When Kendall arrived, I told him I was quitting. He nodded. "I understand," he said. "Finish the week. Give me time to find coverage." "I can't go back in there, Kendall. I heard a voice." His face changed. The exhaustion I was used to seeing was still there, but beneath it, something sharper surfaced. Fear. "What kind of voice?" "I don't know, humming or trying to talk. It was it from one source or multiple?" "I couldn't tell. It was muffled." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Finish the week, please. 3 more shifts. I'll make some calls." I should have said no. Every rational part of me was screaming to say no. But there was something in his voice, a specific kind of desperation that I recognized because I'd heard it in my own voice during those late-night phone calls to the dispatcher. The desperation of someone who knows something terrible and can't face it alone. 3 shifts, I said. 3 shifts. The first of those 3 shifts was May 29th. I arrived at the facility at 9:45, same as always. Parked, unlocked the gate, unlocked the front door, walked in. Something was different. It took me a moment to identify it because it wasn't visual. It was olfactory. The smell had changed. The facility always had a smell, a low-level antiseptic tang, layered over the deeper, sweeter scent of preservation. You got used to it. It became background noise for your nose. But tonight, there was something else underneath it. Something older. Like soil after a heavy rain, mixed with something mineral and sharp. Like copper. Like old pennies in a wet hand. I checked the office. Everything normal. Binder on the desk, heater clicking, generator light green. I walked to the corridor and stood at the freezer door. The smell was stronger here. I opened the door. The freezer was dark, not dim, not flickering. Dark. The fluorescent lights, all 6 tubes mounted in the ceiling, were off. The only light came from the corridor behind me, a thin rectangle that stretched across the rubber grating and stopped about 4 feet in. Beyond that, nothing. Absolute black. I stepped back and checked the light switch on the wall outside the door. It was in the on position. I flipped it off and on. Nothing happened. The light stayed dead. I went back to the office and got my flashlight. It was a cheap LED model I'd bought at the hardware store downstairs from my apartment. It threw a focused beam about 20 feet, and a wider ambient glow about 10. I'd used it for the footprint investigation. I'd never needed it inside the facility. I stood at the freezer entrance and turned it on. The beam cut into the darkness and found the first row of tables, shapes under sheets. Still, normal. The thermostat display on the wall glowed green, 34.0. But the air was wrong. Not just the smell, the weight of it. Heavier, thicker. Like the atmosphere in the room had been replaced with something denser. Each breath felt like effort. I walked in. My footsteps on the rubber grating were the only sound. No hum from the cooling unit. That stopped me. The cooling unit ran constantly. It was the heartbeat of the facility. I'd heard it every single night for 2 months. A low, steady drone that lived in the walls and the floor and the air itself. And now it was silent. But the temperature was still 34.0. How? If the cooling unit was off, the temperature should be rising. Slowly given the insulation, but measurably. It shouldn't be sitting at a perfect 34.0 with no active refrigeration. Unless something else was keeping it cold. I swept the flashlight across the room. Table 1, empty. Margaret Hoffman had been transferred. Table 2, John Doe, sheet in place. Table 3, Lyle Purcell, sheet in place. Table 4, Dale Emmerich. I stopped. Dale Emmerich's sheet was on the floor, not bunched at his feet, on the floor, and his body was gone. The table was empty, just a bare steel surface with a faint residue where a body had been lying for almost 3 months. The tag card was still in his clip. Dale Emmerich, age 67, cardiac event, pending estate. But the body, the actual physical remains of Dale Emmerich, was not on the table. My flashlight beam trembled. I swept it across the rest of the room. Table 5, unidentified female, present. Table 6, Anna Corin, present. Table 7, Roger Malvey, present. Table 8, Walter Grieve, present. Table 9, Teresa Lean, present. Table 11, Carl de Jong, also empty. 2 bodies were missing. I backed toward the door. My flashlight swung wide and caught something on the floor near the far wall, the back wall, the one that faced the soybean field, the one where the footprints had led. I trained the beam on it. A shape on the floor, in the corner where the back wall met the side wall. A body, sitting on the floor, knees drawn up to its chest, arms wrapped around its shins, positioned in the corner like a child in a thunderstorm. Gray-blue skin, white hair, thin frame. Carl de Jong. He was sitting in the corner of the freezer, in the dark, hugging his knees. The flashlight beam shook so badly that the shadows danced. I gripped it with both hands and steadied myself and looked at him. His head was down, chin to chest. His eyes, I could see them now, were open, not staring, not focused, just open. Glassy and filmed over with the white haze of decomposition, but open, and his mouth was moving, not speaking, not making sound, just working. The jaw shifting slowly up and down, the lips pressing together and separating, like a man chewing something he couldn't swallow, or like a man trying to form a word he'd forgotten. I ran. I don't remember the corridor. I don't remember getting to the office. I was at the desk and the phone was in my hand and I was dialing the after hours number, and my fingers were so cold they could barely find the holes in the rotary dial. The dispatcher answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting. Table 4 and Table 11 are off their tables, I said. My voice was remarkably steady considering that everything inside me was collapsing. De Jong is in the back corner, sitting, his eyes are open, his mouth is moving. Emmerich is, I don't know where Emmerich is. The lights are out, the cooling unit is off, but the temperature is stable. Something is very wrong. Something is, lock the freezer door. What? Go to the freezer door, lock it, use the exterior bolt. Do it now. I hadn't even noticed there was an exterior bolt, but when I went back to the corridor, every muscle in my body fighting against the direction I was walking, I saw it. A heavy steel bolt, painted the same gray as the door frame, positioned at the top of the door. It had a sliding mechanism with a padlock loop, though there was no padlock attached. I slid the bolt home. It chunked into place with a sound that echoed down the corridor like a gunshot. It's locked, I said into the phone. I'd brought it with me, the cord stretched from the office. Taut and thin, the handset pressed to my ear. Stay away from the door. Do not open it for any reason. Do not listen at the door. We're en route. Who's we? How many? Everyone. He hung up. I stood in the corridor, holding the phone, staring at the bolted freezer door. From the other side, I could hear the tapping. Faster now. Not the slow, measured rhythm from before. This was rapid, urgent, like a dozen hands drumming on steel in accelerating tempo, and beneath it, the voices, plural, overlapping, the same muffled humming, groaning, almost speaking sound, but multiplied. A choir of dead throats trying to remember what language was. I went back to the office. I sat in a chair. I put my hands on the desk and pressed them flat to stop the shaking. The sounds from the freezer grew louder. I could hear them through two walls in a corridor. Tapping, voices, and now something else was scraping. Heavy, prolonged scraping, like furniture being dragged across a floor, or like a steel table being pushed. Then, a bang, a single concussive impact against the freezer door. Hard enough to shake the wall, I saw the door frame in the corridor vibrate. Then another, and another. Rhythmic, deliberate. Something was hitting the door from inside. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body had entered a state I'd never experienced before, a paralysis that wasn't physical, but psychological. My muscles worked fine. I could have stood up, walked to my car, and driven away. But something had locked my mind into a loop of pure, distilled fear that left no room for decision-making. I could only sit and listen. The banging stopped after 37 impacts. I counted them. In the silence that followed, I heard something new. Scratching on the inside of the freezer door. Not the distant old scratches on the walls. This was close, right against the door. The sound of fingernails, multiple sets of fingernails dragging against steel. Slow and deliberate, starting at the bottom and working up, then back down, then up again, over and over. And then very clearly, as if someone were standing on the other side of the door with their mouth pressed to the seam between door and frame. A whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I heard the cadence, the rhythm of speech, the rise and fall of syllables, the pauses between phrases. Someone was whispering to me through the door, and though I couldn't understand them, I felt in a way that bypassed my ears and went straight to some deeper, more primitive receiver that they were asking me to open it. Headlights swept across the office window. Not one vehicle, multiple. I heard gravel spraying, doors slamming, voices, real voices, living voices calling to each other. The front door opened and people filed in. 6 of them. The man and woman from the SUV were there, but also 4 others I'd never seen. They wore dark utility clothing, not uniforms, but coordinated. 2 of them carried equipment cases. One had what looked like a surveying instrument. The last one carried a duffel bag that clanked with metal when he set it down. The man from the SUV, the tall one with the shaved head, looked at me. How long since you locked the door? 20 minutes, maybe 25. And the sounds? Banging, scratching, and talking. Something is talking. He didn't react. He just nodded, like I'd told him the weather. Then he turned to his team and said, "Full protocol, thermal first. Nobody goes in until we have a read." The woman with the clipboard pulled a handheld device from one of the cases, a thermal imaging camera, I realized. She pressed it against the freezer door and studied the screen. I saw her face change. The clinical composure she'd maintained during our first meeting cracked, just slightly. She showed the screen to the tall man. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "They're standing." "All of them?" someone asked. "All of them, in a circle, center of the room." Silence. The kind of silence that's louder than noise because you can hear people deciding how afraid to be. The tall man turned to me. "Did you find all the bodies? You said 2 were off their tables." "I found De Jong in the corner. Emmerich, I didn't see him. He could be anywhere in there." "Could he have left the freezer?" The question hit me like ice water. "What? Before you locked the door, could a body have left the freezer and entered the corridor or the office?" I thought about it. I tried to remember the sequence. I'd walked in, found the empty tables, Seen De Jong, run out, called the dispatcher, gone back to bolt the door. Had I looked in the corridor? Had I checked the bathroom? Had I don't know, I said. The tall man looked at two of his team members. Clear the building. Every room. Now. They moved through the facility methodically. Office, corridor, bathroom. The small utility closet I'd never opened. The crawl space access panel in the ceiling of the corridor. It took 5 minutes. Clear, one of them reported. No remains outside the cold storage unit. The tall man exhaled. It was the first human thing I'd seen him do. Okay, so they're all in there. He walked to the freezer door and placed his palm flat against it. The scratching had stopped. The whispers had stopped. The building was silent except for the sound of breathing 7 living people, all staring at a locked steel door. What happens now? I asked. We wait, the tall man said. They settle. They always settle. By morning, they'll be back on the tables. And if they're not? He didn't answer. We waited. The team set up in the office in the corridor. They placed monitoring equipment, thermal cameras, audio sensors, something that measured electromagnetic frequencies. They spoke in low voices, using terminology I didn't understand. Words like kinetic saturation and displacement threshold and convergence event. At 3:47 a.m., the woman with the clipboard checked the thermal camera and announced that the bodies had returned to the tables. Supine, standard positions, no anomalies. At 4 a.m., the tall man unbolted the freezer door and went in with 2 team members. They were inside for 40 minutes. When they came out, their faces were gray. Not just pale gray, the color of people who've seen something that doesn't belong in the world they understand. All 9 accounted for, the tall man said. All repositioned. De Jong and Emmerich are back on their tables. And the circle? Someone asked. He paused. There are marks on the floor, in the center of the room, where they were standing. Another pause. It's a pattern, concentric, same as the last convergence. How long between convergences? Last one was 8 months ago. Before that, 14 months. Before that, 23 months. He looked at his notes. The interval is shortening. I stood in the corner of the office listening to professionals discuss the impossible in the same tone they'd use for a budget meeting. And I understood finally what this place was. Not a morgue, not an overflow facility, a containment site, a place where something happened to the dead, something that had been happening for decades, maybe longer. And the only response anyone had was to document it, bolt the door, and wait for it to stop. I quit, I said. The tall man looked at me. I understand. We'll need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. A what? Standard. You don't discuss what happens here. Not with friends, not with family, not online. In exchange, the county provides a severance package and a positive employment reference. And if I don't sign? His expression didn't change. Everyone signs. I signed, but I didn't leave. Not right away. And this is the part I've never told anyone, the part that the NDA was specifically designed to prevent me from sharing. But I'm sharing it now because what happened next is the reason I haven't slept more than 3 hours a night in 8 months. And the reason I can't be in a room below 50 degrees without my hands going numb and my vision narrowing. And the reason I check every single night before I go to bed that my body is exactly where I put it. I stayed for one more shift. June 1st, my last night. Kendall had called me that afternoon. He sounded different, not exhausted, not evasive. Scared. Actually, genuinely scared. He said the team had found something during their post-convergence inspection. Something in the drainage system under the floor grating. He wouldn't say what, but he said they'd removed all the bodies except one. Which one? I asked. Anna Corrin. Why her? She's the focus. She's been the focus since she arrived. They're keeping her for study. Study? They're going to study just come in tonight. One more night. They need someone on site while they set up the new monitoring equipment. I do it myself, but He trailed off. But what? I can't go back in the dark. Not after what they showed me. What did they show you, Kendall? Silence then. The drainage system under the freezer connects to something. Something that isn't on any building plan. It goes down, way down. And at the bottom, The scratches are on the inside. I didn't understand what he meant. Not then, but I went in that night because some part of me, some ruined, compulsive, self-destructive part, needed to see it through. The facility was different when I arrived. The parking lot had 3 vehicles in it, the black SUV and 2 white vans. Equipment was staged in the corridor. Cases, cables, a portable generator. The freezer door was open and the interior was lit, not by the overhead fluorescence, but by portable work lights on tripods, casting harsh white beams that erased every shadow. The freezer was almost empty. 11 tables bare. Only table 6 remained occupied. Anicorn, sheet in place, tag card in its clip. But the floor grating had been pulled up. In the center of the room, a section about 6 feet square had been removed, exposing the drainage channel beneath. In the drainage channel, which I'd always assumed was a shallow trough leading to a pipe, was something else entirely. It was a shaft, a vertical shaft, maybe 3 feet in diameter, lined with the same stainless steel as the freezer walls. It dropped straight down into darkness. The work lights illuminated the first 10 or 12 feet. Corroded steel, moisture beading on the surfaces, the faint residue of biological fluid on the walls. Below that, nothing. Black. One of the team members, a woman I hadn't seen before, older, with short gray hair and the calm demeanor of someone who's been doing this for a long time, was standing near the shaft, operating a device that lowered a camera on a cable into the opening. "How deep?" I asked. She looked at me. "We've fed 70 meters of cable and haven't hit bottom." 70 meters, over 200 feet, straight down. Under a building with no basement, built on flat Iowa farmland, in a spot where the water table sat at 10 feet below grade. "That's not possible," I said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." I looked at the monitor she was watching. The camera feed showed the interior of the shaft descending into increasingly corroded metal. The walls were covered in scratches, the same parallel scratches I'd seen on the freezer walls, but denser, deeper, carved into the steel with force. And as the camera went deeper, the scratches became more organized. They stopped being random and started forming patterns. Rows, columns, repetitions. "What is that?" I whispered. "We think it's a language," the woman said, "or an attempt at one. The same patterns appear on the wall scratches upstairs. We've been cataloging them for 12 years. There are over 400 distinct symbols." "Who's making them?" She looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Patient, sad, like a doctor about to deliver the worst news of your life. "They are," she said. "The bodies, when they move, when they scratch the walls, when they tap the tables, they're writing. We don't know what they're writing. We don't know who they're writing to, but they've been doing it for at least 40 years, and the messages are getting longer." I looked back at the monitor. The camera was at 60 meters now. The scratches on the shaft walls were so dense they almost obscured the metal underneath. And at the very edge of the camera's range, just at the boundary where light gave way to complete darkness, I saw something that ended my ability to process the world in the way I've been processing it for 31 years. There were hands reaching up from below. Dozens of them, gray-blue and motionless, protruding from the walls of the shaft like roots growing out of soil. Fingers splayed, palms flat against the steel, as if they'd been pushing through from the other side and gotten stuck. Some were skeletal, some were intact, some were somewhere in between, flesh hanging in strips from exposed bone. And they were all reaching upward. I stepped back from the monitor. The woman steadied me. I must have swayed and said something I didn't hear because my ears were filled with a sound like static, or like wind, or like the whisper I'd heard through the freezer door, but multiplied by 100, 1,000, filling my skull until there was no room for thought. Behind us on table 6, Anicorn sat up. Not slowly, not the gradual elevation I'd seen with Teresa Lunt. She sat up in one fluid motion, like someone waking from a nap, and turned her head toward the shaft. The sheet fell to her waist. Her eyes were open, clear, not filmed, not hazed. Clear blue eyes that tracked across the room and settled on me. And she smiled. I've spent 8 months trying to describe that smile, and I can't do it justice. It wasn't menacing. It wasn't evil. It was the smile of recognition. The smile you give someone when you finally see them after a long separation. Warm, familiar, intimate, but there was nothing behind it. No consciousness, no person. Just the mechanical reproduction of an expression by muscles that had no right to move, operated by something that understood the shape of human communication, but not its meaning. A puppet smile, perfect in form, hollow in substance. And then she spoke. One word, clear as glass, in a voice that was hers and wasn't hers the right pitch, the right timbre, but wrong in a way I can't articulate, like a recording played backward and then forward again, with something lost in the translation. She said my name, not my work name, not the name on my badge or my intake forms. My name, the one my mother used, the one that nobody in Weldon County knew, because I'd gone by my middle name since I was 19 and had never told a soul in Iowa the first one. She said it, and she smiled, and she looked at the shaft, and then she lay back down, smoothly, gently, like a woman going back to sleep. The sheets settled over her as if pulled by invisible hands. Her eyes closed. Her face composed itself into the slack neutrality of death. The room was silent. The woman with the camera was staring at me. What did she say? I didn't answer. I walked out of the freezer. I walked down the corridor. I walked through the office and out the front door and across the gravel lot, and I got in my car and I drove. I drove for 4 hours. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. I didn't look in the rearview mirror because I was afraid in a way that I will be afraid for the rest of my life, that if I looked, I would see a dead woman in the back seat, smiling at me with clear blue eyes and saying my name. That was 8 months ago. I'm in Topeka now. Different state, different name. The county never contacted me, no phone calls, no letters, no men in dark SUVs. The severance check cleared. The NDA sits in a drawer I never open. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Here's the thing that I've circled back to 1,000 times. The thing that finally made me decide to tell this story despite the agreement I signed. The footprints, the ones I found outside the building. All left feet, walking toward the wall, walking into the wall. 3 weeks after I left Weldon, I was in a motel outside Kansas City. I couldn't sleep, I never can anymore. So I was lying in bed watching the ceiling and trying not to think about freezers. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside my ground floor window. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the concrete walkway outside my room. I held my breath. The footsteps approached my window and stopped. Right outside, right there, I could see the shadow of feet, bare feet in the gap between the bottom of the curtain and the windowsill. They stood there for a long time. Minutes. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay in that motel bed and stared at the shadow of 2 bare feet standing on concrete in the cold, and I waited for whatever was going to happen next. After 7 minutes, I counted every second the feet turned and walked away. Slowly, one step at a time, fading into silence. In the morning, I went outside and looked at the walkway. There were wet marks on the concrete where the feet had been. They were cold to the touch, and there was only one set of prints, both left feet. I've moved 3 times since then, different cities, different motels, and every few weeks, not every night, not on a schedule I can predict, I hear them. Footsteps outside my window, always at night, always between midnight and 4 a.m., always bare feet, always stopping right outside. They never try the door, they never knock, they never speak, they just stand there and wait. I don't know what they're waiting for. I don't know if it's the bodies from the freezer or something from the shaft or something else entirely, something that wears the shape of the dead the way you'd wear a coat. I don't know what's at the bottom of that shaft or what the scratches say or why Anna Corrin knew my name. But I know this, the bodies in the freezer were never just moving. They were practicing, learning to walk again, learning to sit, learning to stand, learning to speak, and whatever they were becoming, whatever was coming up through that shaft, filling them like water fills a glass, it's not staying in the freezer anymore. It followed me. And I think, though I'm not sure And I pray to God I'm wrong. I think it's getting closer. Because last night, for the first time, the footsteps didn't stop at my window. They stopped at my door, and the handle moved.